Good morning, YouTube. It is a crisp and fresh 70-degree morning here in Southern California. Watch till the end of the video, and I'll dox myself, so we can have a nice little fan meet up, and you can ask me some questions, and I'll give you a water bottle. It'll be fun. So this is one of the more long-term projects that's just coming to an end now, and I am hesitant to touch it, but this is the legendary and fabled Turf War jar. And so what is so special about this is that usually my projects denote a small amount of factors at play. You know, I do it like a traditional experiment. I try to isolate variables, you have a control variable, you set things, you leave other things to variate. But this one was, the experiment itself was based around how several different factors would interact with one another in a closed environment. And the reason that I call this the Turf War jar is that it housed a little biological conflict, essentially. I noticed that this empty guacamole jar, which is where that comes from now, had some mold growing on it. And since no one wanted it, the food was all gone, I took it outside and I tried to think of something that could, you know, ideally fight with mold. You know, what could be the natural enemy. And eventually I took several packets of yeast and I placed them in the jar and I began to pour in sugar over a period of a few days so as to give something for the yeast to feed off of. And the idea was, let's see how these two things interact with one another. You know, the yeast is going to grow much faster than the mold while the sugar is there, but once the sugar runs out, you know, does the mold overtake it? Or is it possible they work together? Have these two organisms been in contact often in nature? It's kind of what I wanted to see. So to provide extra fuel source, I wanted a neutral ground, something both the yeast and the mold could feed off of. Mold grows on, you know, plant matter, and yeast feeds off sugar. So I threw in several old raspberries, which you can just kind of see now. They're very blackened by now. And so from there, a very interesting thing happened. Possibly the one thing I could not have predicted. A third party joined the conflict. Yes, that's right. So because of the raspberries and because they weren't immediately wiped out by the yeast or the mold, there began to be a fruit fly population inside the jar, which was fascinating and really great to study. So over a period of days, each day I would check in and I would see how many flies were there, you know, how many were buzzing around, and I tried to count the maggots, but I believe they're all gone now. Eventually, the flies died, and things happened in kind of the order you'd expect. Spoiler alert. The flies were the first to go once there wasn't a food source, and then the yeast bubbled down, and that eventually left, and then finally the mold. I guess mold is still surviving. The reason the jar is so... The reason it looks like a 3-year-old pony jar is because it's basically completely rotten by now. Eventually, I added in some extra water just to see if that would give some last kick of life to what was kicking around in there, but that did not work. That really did not work. So that was the experiment in full. It was a really nice one. One of the more complex